Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. My name is Tiffany, aka The Black Rose. On this channel here, I talk about all things occult and metaphysical, spirituality, the law of attraction, relationships, and more. So today I want to cover the energy of the 1920s and spirituality in the 1920s and 30s. Mostly in the Western world, in America, but also a little bit in Europe. And I think it's fun to go back to different timelines and delve into certain history that isn't widely discussed, because when we talk about the 1920s, we talk about the jazz age, the fashion, the movies, but rarely do we get into things like spirituality and what people were practicing apart from Christianity. Like, there were people, practicing other things besides Christianity and following organized religions. Even though that was more common for that time period, people were also into other things, but you don't really hear people talk about that. Everyone just assumes everyone was Christian during those periods. And a majority of people, like, especially in America, and even especially in Europe as well, like, a lot of people there were Christian. In fact, I'd say, the churches were full back in those times, and it took people a while to kind of step out of that and explore different things, or get back to their roots, get back to their heritage, and try, something different, or kind of follow something that's more aligned with their journey. Because while Christianity is great, it's not necessarily for everyone. And Christianity for me, I grew up in it. I was kind of like, everyone in my family was into it, and I didn't have a problem with it, but I knew there was more to life and more to spirituality than Christianity. I think, like, a lot of people feel that way. And these days, a lot of people are kind of getting back to what their ancestors used to practice, because in the past, with our ancestors, a lot of them were given religions. A lot of them were kind of stripped of their cultural traditions and cultural religions. They were sometimes forced, a lot of the times forced to convert and forced to follow a certain religion, and it was usually like Christianity and all of that. So, but not just Christianity, a lot of people, all over the world, when people were like conquering in different nations, different countries, they would force whoever they conquered, they would like force them to leave whatever they were practicing and force them into something like new that they themselves were into, and also to control them, because a lot of these religions are or were set up sometimes to like control the masses. And the churches would work alongside the government, so whoever, or the ruling emperor, or whoever was in charge at the time. So the church would work with the so-called elite people in power. They would work with them, and to kind of monitor and police the masses, and also like police women and all this kind of stuff. I want to get into the spirituality of the 1920s and 1930s and what people were practicing specifically in the Americas and in Europe, and how like people's idea about spirituality, how their ideas and concepts about spirituality were changing, and how they were becoming more open-minded and revisiting the past, like revisiting what their ancestors practiced. Because deep down, we have, like, through our bloodlines we're kind of connected to our ancestors and connected to people from the past. I look at film, movies, art, literature, and advertisements from the past as well as the present, because I admire both the artistic aspects of these great works and also the spiritual aspects, the symbolism, the deeper meanings of these creations. And there's different ways of looking at things and we can look from the surface level and say, oh, that's a great show, that's a cool poster, oh, this actress or this model looks great, but what are these creations trying to express to us? Like, what kinds of messages are the creators trying to get across to their audience? Because when I look at a lot of the films and adverts in fashion from the early 1900s, I see blatant in-your-face occult symbolism even more than other decades. Compared to the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, you know, when orchestrated religion was really prominent and popular, you know, I wasn't really seeing as much of that occult symbolism as I was seeing with the 1920s. And even the 1930s, it was like drifting off. But that period from, I'd say, 1918 to 1929, you see a lot of occult symbolism. And because, you know, people were going, different nations were going to places like Egypt and the Middle East and traveling, like everyone was traveling a lot, especially if you had a lot of money during that time. Like a lot of people were traveling, and they kind of picked up a lot of the spiritual teachings, and they would study like the occult. They would go to the pyramids, and they would have interpreters and stuff like that, leaders from different nations, as well as wealthy people. So yeah, they would really get into that, and they would kind of bring it back and incorporate it into their advertisements, movies, businesses, furniture, architecture, fashion, like all kinds of things. And I find that really interesting, you know, how that's reflected in the 1920s and 1930s, how it's reflected in their media and in their pop culture. You can see the influence from all the other countries. Like you can see the Arabic influence, or like Saudi Arabian, Moroccan, Persian. You can see that because they have like the Moroccan rugs in their houses, and even their, like, the Art Deco style from the 1920s is like kind of sometimes they incorporate different cultural images or elements into that. So, and also, you know, orchestrated and organized religions were still very popular in the 1920s and 30s. And I'm not like saying they weren't around, they definitely were. I think the majority of people were into the organized religions and structured religions, and there's not anything wrong with that, but there was also people into the metaphysical things and into occult and into spirituality as well. So, and also like during the 1920s, it was quite fashionable to be, you know, into that, and to like, you know, try new things out. And it was because after the war, after the First World War, people they kind of wanted to break free, like, and try different things, and they wanted to kind of express themselves more. That's why you see, you know, that with the jazz and all that, you know, and 1920s are called the Jazz Age, and the Roaring 20s, they like came out with a bang, like, and they wanted to really express themselves and free up their soul, their spirit, because they had been through a lot with the war. And so that was a period when they could just let loose a bit and all that. And obviously during that time excuse me, during that time, right, mannerisms and how you would address people were different than now. So I'm not saying like their version of letting loose is obviously different than our version of letting loose. Like how we let loose is like completely different to how they let loose. You know, they would probably be horrified at like what we do now, but what they did, what the younger people did in the 1920s is considered scandalous for the time, because the way that women dress, like, I have my 1920s look right now today, but the way that women dressed in that time was a bit scandalous, because, you know, showing the arms and showing, you know, showing legs and all that was like a big deal, you know, because before that, like during the war times and all that, and just before that, like women were, they were like seen and not heard, you know. They were kind of like in the background and, you know, not really. But then in the 1920s, women started working, they started like being in the workplace, and apart from just staying at home and looking after children and being a stay-at-home mom, they had like jobs, they had access to things they didn't have access to in the past, and also like makeup. They started taking more care and not more care, because they did take care before, but they started to develop a certain look, you know, the flapper look. And like in the movies, it makes it seem like everyone had money and stuff like that. If you look at certain movies from the 1920s, not all, because I've looked at a lot, they have like, you know, different socioeconomic groups, but in certain movies it might make it seem like everyone was living a lavish lifestyle, but that wasn't necessarily the case, especially in like in America and just all over the world. Like not everyone had that access to that lifestyle. And so yes, people would try to take the easy way out, you know. They would steal, they would do all kinds of things to get by, because times were hard for some people during the 1920s, and especially in the 1930s when everything crashed, right? So yeah, some people had a bit of a rebellious streak, and this also and with everyone and certain people having this rebellious streak, of course they wanted to break out of the controlled, organized religions. They wanted to see what was beyond that, and do things that was beyond that. And not just people with a rebellious streak, but also even like professional people, like even, you know, your doctors, lawyers and all. Some of these people were actually into the occult and metaphysics, and spirituality, and they would practice it, and they were into it. So, you know, there was the formal stuffy crowd, and then there was the, you know, flappers and the sheiks and the performers and the more expressive, extravagant people during that period that were I wouldn't say like they were the majority. No, they weren't the majority. They're just like the more expressive, the artists, the performers, you know, those kinds of people. And but they basically paved the way and set the tone, you know, for all the other decades after, and also set the tone for things like Hollywood and mainstream music, like the music industry in America. So that's why it's important to it's important to like look at this, because when we see at where we are now, like when we look at like what we're doing now and all this and how we got here, we need to like go back to the past and kind of, you know, through the decades and see how we got to the place we are now. And also if you're an artist or a creator and you're creating certain things, I find like for myself, I like to go back to different decades and pick up on certain styles and influences. I find them inspiring. I find that it can inspire my own creativity or artwork. So I do like going back to the past. And they really wanted to go out with a bang, and they were excited and hopeful and happy, you know, for the new lifestyle changes. And yeah, I'm not saying that everything was perfect, but you know, people were working to make things, you know, a certain way. Like they really utilized this decade to push their manifestations, to push their goals through, and to achieve and overcome certain obstacles. They were basically laying down a new road. Like they were going all in or nothing. And like sometimes we need to kind of like improve things, because if we're stuck in the past and doing things a certain way in the past and very rigid and very narrow-minded, it's not very helpful, and it's not helpful to us, it's not helpful to people around us. And it's good to just, you know, try different things out and progress as a society, as people, you know. But anyway, so people were trying to change everything. So they were trying to improve like things like family dynamics, gender equality, women's rights. People were tackling racism. They were trying to create more peace and unity, even through like art and music and stuff. Like you don't have to like go out in the street and necessarily riot. Like everyone has their own way of tackling issues and tackling things, you know. Sometimes it's just like sitting down with a small group of people having a conversation. Like everyone has their own way of doing their part, doing their part to tackle certain issues. And I would never say like one way is superior than the other, because as a collective, everyone has their own way of going about things, and whatever works for you is what works for you, right? Yeah. So, and with the Jazz Age as well, you know, that the Jazz Age kind of did help, you know, not solve everything, but it did help a bit with race issues. I'm gonna get into that. Yeah, like a lot of these things, the jazz, the hoodoo, mojo, which were around during the 1920s and 30s. I mean, they were around before, but they were kind of getting even more popular and mainstream. Like, just even take out jazz. Let's go into the hoodoo, voodoo, mojo, like, and even Wicca and paganism. Like, this was becoming very mainstream, okay? During the 1920s. And a lot of more people were practicing it than before, like than previous periods, because everyone was so like into the Christianity, into the church. They were so blinded by that it was even unheard of to like hear about people in your town like practicing this stuff. Like no, like, or it had such stigma attached to it. Like people would kind of ostracize you, like they kind of, you know. So that's why, you know, people had to really practice in secret. Like they really had to practice in secret when they're doing it, because people back then were more formal. They were like more conservative, so they wouldn't really accept people like that. Some people would, some people wouldn't. Like it depended on the family and their their upbringing. But yeah, a lot of people weren't into that. A lot of people didn't accept it. So that whole the jazz and the hoodoo stemmed from oppression a bit, you know, or came from oppression a bit, because it came from the melanated people of the Americas, you know. So after slavery, these things were brought out more and expressed more, because people wanted to, slavery was a rough time, and they kind of wanted to get the power back, get their connection back. So yeah, and jazz had a really big impact on American culture. Like I said before, like everyone was into it, like everyone was listening to it. But it stemmed from Black Americans, like that's where it's originally from. Voodoo is practiced in America and the Caribbean, and I have family in the Caribbean, in Trinidad. So voodoo, you know, it didn't necessarily stem out of oppression. Voodoo is like a mix. The Caribbean and the Americas, the Black people there are mixed with and have influences because of colonization, but also they're mixed with the natives and French and Spanish and all that. So hoodoo and voodoo have influences from different cultures, but hoodoo specifically is like root work, and you know, working with earthly elements, working with roots and those compounds. During slavery times, you know, people were given organized religions, and their original cultures, way of life and spirituality, you know, was almost obliterated and destroyed. So people had to practice these things in secret. And also, even like in other countries, like even in Europe, the Celtic people and pagans in Europe were indoctrinated into Catholicism and to become Protestants. So yeah, if you were caught practicing anything else, you know, outside of that, there would have been consequences. Because the church had a lot of power during that time. It's not like now, okay? Like church back in the day, you know, was like working along with the government, and church had a lot of power, so you know, you have to be careful, right? So yeah, yeah, indoctrinated religions sometimes were mandatory for a lot of families up until a certain period, and it was a way to keep people controlled, like control their perception and their subconscious, because this is not just like telling people what to do. This is like a program. This is a program, okay? They're programming your subconscious. So for you to think a certain way, for you to feel a certain way, for you to have certain emotions or dispositions about yourself and the people that look like you, like this shit goes deep. Goes deep. So yeah. But the thing is, you know, people remember their true history. A lot of people remember their true history because it was passed down by word of mouth. So even when people tried to eradicate certain cultures or people and ways of living, the history still remains. You know, you can't really wipe out everything from people. You can't. The colonizing spirits and colonizing energy can't really wipe out everything. It probably tried, but you know, I mean, all that information is still there. It's still accessible and people can still understand it. So I mean, yeah, you know, when you try to eradicate something so much, and when you try to eradicate something, you kind of magnify it more, like, because it's like if you try to cover something up and control it and hide it and twist it or pervert it and make it seem undesirable or unworthy, you know, the more people will be drawn to it, because that's like a reverse psychology thing, you know what I mean? Like, if people are so, like, you know, hiding certain things and hiding certain information, like, people are gonna be suspicious, because they're gonna feel that energy. They're gonna feel that energy from whoever's hiding something, you know, like when you're around someone, and there's a lot of people, I'm sure maybe someone listening has this, you know, when you're around someone and you can kind of pick up on what they're feeling and even their thoughts, you know, and you can tell if they're hiding something. Well, a lot of people can do that with, like, it doesn't matter how rich or powerful someone is, like, we can all pick up on what's going on with you, you know. So the more you try to hide something, the more you magnify it. The more you try to cover it up, the more it gets shown. As I mentioned earlier, you know, going back to certain timelines is important, because spirituality and lineage, or, you know, our bloodlines are important because they hold records on various things. You know, your DNA houses your Akashic records in a sense. So going back in time to see, you know, who your ancestors were, you know, where they came from, and also, you know, what they were practicing before Christianity. So, and what they were practicing before orchestrated religions. All those things are important to know. Besides Christianity, what were people doing in terms of, like, spirituality? Like, what kind of things were they into? Well, people would hold seances, and they do tarot card readings, palmistry, root work, you know, hoodoo things. You know, they would also do the root work. A lot of Black Americans, or even people down in the islands, you know, would do the voodoo and all that. So people would channel spirits. They would channel ancestors, and they would do scrying, predict future events. People also started their own clubs and groups dedicated to spirituality, and women also did beauty spells. And cosmetics were getting very popular during that time, and women were transforming their appearance, not only for like expression, but also to attract certain outcomes in life. So to attract their desired mate. And people practice the law of attraction and manifesting and visualization. So also, all the Freemason and cult stuff, like that was around too. But not everyone into spirituality and the occult were like joining those clubs, okay? Like a lot of people just practice with their friends or just by themselves. Like not everyone was just like off to join a cult, you know what I'm saying? When it came to Hollywood, apparently, this is widely reported, a lot of the film stars from the 1920s, and this is when film just, became like up and running. Like this is when Hollywood's kind of was establishing itself and all that, because in the past a lot of people would just go to like live jazz clubs or like live theater. Like theater was it before Hollywood was it. Like everyone would be at the theater, or they'd be at like a dance venue or a club, kind of a restaurant where they would have food, and then they would have like a dance hall. They would have like, so that's what was popular before the movies in the cinemas. And they had house parties as well. And so, yeah, people in Hollywood, a lot of the film stars in the 1920s actually immersed themselves in the occult. And I think we all know that by now, right? And they were into like finding out the deeper things in life and the occult, like, so. But that also came across through the cinema and through what they were producing. Like I noticed in a lot of the films, it had a lot of occult references and things from certain ancient texts or things from certain ancient cultures. So they really incorporated a lot of these teachings, principles, and stories. They incorporated a lot of the stories into their movies. And yeah. And obviously that set the tone for like a lot of the films coming after, right? So, yeah. I was looking at the movies, I'm like, wait a second, like, how come all these movies, has something like somebody's doing like a palm reading, someone's like scrying, and then I was like, okay, well, they're into the occult for sure, like big time, like, and what I find interesting is compared to the movies after, like in the 40s, 50s, 60s, I don't see as much of that as I did in the 1920s movies for some reason. And even like the 1930s, it was kind of dying off, like, so it was like a trend. Like in the 1920s, it was like that, it was really popular, it was like trendy, but later on people were back to the formal religion, or even in the movie, that's what was like pushed, like that's what people were into. And they would, and the movies after the 1920s, like if someone was practicing paganism, witchcraft, whatever occult things, they were usually made to seem bad. They were made to seem like the evil witch, the evil villain, right? Especially, in movies from the 1950s. It just, even up until now, that they're still like, they try to stigmatize that in Hollywood. They try to make it seem bad, but they're the ones practicing it, like the reporter said, he went to the studio and he saw them like full on like practicing it. This is not practicing it for the camera. This is practicing it for the sake of practicing it, okay? When people are into their like chart and like the planetary changes and shifts and dimensional shifts and quantum jumping and all this kind of stuff, that these people are like full on immersed. These people, like, it's not even like a curiosity anymore. It's not they're like full on, like their life, everything is immersed in the occult, okay? So, yeah, I find that really interesting, you know, because when people talk about times from the past, everyone's like, oh, everyone was so religious, everyone was so, you know, not everyone, apparently not. But, you know, there were conservative people. There always are conservative people. It's just we're in a world of duality, so there's gonna be people that are like, oh, I'm not into this, you know. There's always gonna be like opposing opinions, opposing sides, and you know. Yeah, but like I said before, the younger generation during the 1920s, a lot of them were drawn towards unorthodox, pagan things, and different religions and different spiritual practices. And the conservative people, some of them would call that primitive. You know, they would use the word primitive, because anything that wasn't Christian and anything that wasn't, you know, the mainstream norm, the perfect citizen way of living was considered, you know, ooh, that's taboo, that isn't for me, that's primitive. So they would say things like that. And yet the leaders, the people in charge of these quote-unquote conservative people, were actually practicing the occult and Freemasonry spirituality. They were actually studying that. They were actually into that. So jokes on them, I guess. Yeah, it was conveyed in the media that people were into that, and not just the Hollywood stars, but regular people as well, like the average citizen, you know, was into that a bit. And even in some of the stories from that time, like reflect that. So people were traveling a lot, like I said. They were picking up on the spiritual influences from other countries, and they liked to buy things like incense and frankincense and all that, and they would bring that back to the States, back to Europe, wherever they're from, and it was seen as exotic. It was seen as something that they could work with to enhance their powers and their manifestations, and for their meditation and their serenity and all this. And they would even overlap, you know, they would overlap certain spiritual teachings and go into depth. Like I said before, like they would go into depth. Like this wasn't just like, oh, let's just try this. No. Like a lot of people were full on into this, like serious, you know? Seriously. Ouija boards also became very popular. Like the Ouija boards are portals, basically. You're connecting to another realm, another kind of dimension, and I wouldn't necessarily like write them off like right off the bat and say, oh my god, they're demonic and blah blah blah. I mean people might have experienced demonic things with it, but I'd say, you know, like with anything, like with any realm, any spiritual realm, any metaphysical realm or anything like that, you need to be able to protect yourself, because just like you're protecting your avatar now in this realm, you need to protect yourself in the spiritual realm. And not everything is a joke. Not like, you need to like have a certain frequency and vibration to where you are protecting yourself in all realms and believing in yourself and believing in that. Like that's very important. Anytime in your life you need to do that, because we don't live in a perfect world. So yeah. Everyone had a Ouija board, you know what I'm saying? Like this spirituality thing was actually becoming very mainstream in the 1920s, and even Hollywood was making it more popular in a way, because, you know, the actors and actresses, like I said, they were into the occult during the 1920s and continuing on. So the mainstream public were getting influenced and a bit, you know, programmed a bit, because anything, you know, you're taking in visually is like influencing you and your subconscious and all that. So they were getting a bit programmed. And of course, advertisers and people know this. That's why they always push out all these advertisements to kids and all this. But whatever was made to seem trendy, whatever was made to seem cool and popular, whether it was Ouija boards or certain types of fashion, like the youth would really latch onto it. Like they would, like, even now, it's the same thing now with like social media. The youth really like latch onto it and like emanate it, become one with it. Like they become one with the pop culture, like a whole swarm, a whole movement of the youth latches onto it, and like that becomes part of their decade, that becomes part of their timeline, their experience here. And then people, like the children of these youth or grandchildren of these youth will look back and see them, what they were doing on that timeline, and they'll be like, you had Instagram? What? Like, ew, that's so old. Like, can't believe you had Instagram, you know? Yes, that's what's gonna happen, you know. Our children and our grandchildren are gonna be like, they're gonna be laughing at all the things we were doing now. Excuse me. To the Christians, jazz music was considered sinful, okay? And not every Christian, you know, would scrutinize or dismiss jazz music. You know, I just want to say this. At first, some people were a bit apprehensive about the jazz, and we all know why they were apprehensive about the jazz, right? Because of the skin color and all that. But eventually, people kind of like, they saw like how popular it was becoming. Just, you know, like when there's a sports team and they're starting to win, and then people that were on another team or like following another team just suddenly switch the sports team that's winning just because they're the winners. It was kind of like that with the jazz. And you know, anything that's like really popular and like mainstream and you know, like a lot of people, they want to latch onto it. They want to be a part of it. They want to incorporate it into their business and all that to make money. They want to do all kinds of stuff, right? So yeah, like when the jazz was catching on and getting popular, and when their friends were into the jazz, and they're like, oh well, I guess I have to do the Charleston and go to all these jazz bars now. Like they're really, I need to be, you know, I need to be a modern person. I need to be up to date with the times and get with it. Yeah, so I mean, they didn't really have a choice because that's what was happening and during the time. And they still had segregation, so certain like events and venues and stuff like that. And I'm mainly talking about in America, okay? Because everyone, this is mainly to do with America, you know. But in America, you know, they would have separate kind of jazz bars because segregation was very serious, very, very serious, and very it was very like implemented, like even during the 1920s and 30s. And that isn't to say that black and white people or people of different races didn't interact. They definitely did. And, you know, people were doing business with each other, you know, from different races. But there was still, especially in the South, okay, like especially in the South, you know, in America, people, it was still very much like racist and very much troubling times, and very, very like, there was a lot of like, you know, tension between people. There was a lot of tension. And up north, you know, up north in places like New York and Harlem and stuff, things were more progressive. I'm not saying they were perfect, but it wasn't as bad as the South. Before jazz and stuff, there was like ballroom dancing. There was like, how should I describe it? It was like kind of like classical music. That's what people were listening to a bit before jazz. And, you know, going to theater, going to opera, that was very popular before jazz, right? So this whole kind of jazz thing, and it was a bit more expressive, you know. Before, like when you go to opera and when you go to theater and certain like certain kinds of theater, especially during that time, the theater back then, it was very kind of like sometimes very formal. It was very people had to like, people were very formal, you know, they had certain mannerism or way of expressing themselves that we will say is, oh, you're repressing certain parts of yourself, or you're repressing your sexuality, you're repressing your emotions. And but that's what was normal during the time. And even in like the 1920s and stuff, like people had their own way of expressing themselves, and so did women, you know. And people would say, oh, why do they talk like that? Why do they? Because that's how they express themselves. I mean, they were more formal. They would use more formal greetings, like, or even like if someone had a particular title, like they would say that, you know, good morning, sir, good morning, madam, you know, good morning, whoever, like, I don't know, but they were just very formal, you know. It was a different time, and there was a lot more respect, and like respect for elders, and you know, that's just how people were. They carried themselves in a different manner. They would, if a woman was on a date with a guy, he would like open the car door for her. He would, when they were about to go to the table, he would pull out the chair, and you know, and stuff like that. So it was very, it was just a different time, you know. It was different kind of culture, different customs. And it's funny, you know, if it's funny, like people say, oh, I'm American, I'm Canadian, and I'm this and I'm that, I'm Spanish, but I'm like, if you were to go back in time in your own country and live, and would you feel like you're really what you say you are? Like, would you feel, because the culture back, like when you go back in the decades, the culture is completely different. Like, you feel like you're in another country. I mean, that's how like, yes, it's where you're from, but like the decade is like a whole experience in itself. But in the 1920s, you know, they had this whole thing with the it girl, and Clara Bow, you know, kind of brought this out. And the it girl was kind of like a flapper, and she was kind of considered scandalous and all this, but or like one of those showgirls, one of the girls in the movies and all that. And she'd always wear a lot of makeup and more kind of revealing outfits than the average girl. And and she would always have a lot of tabloid news about her. So a lot of like the newspapers and would talk about her a lot, and who she was dating. And that's continued on today, right? Like there's Kardashians or whoever, you know, today that everyone talks about. And well, when I was younger, it was Paris Hilton. So like, I guess each decade has their it girls and all that. And my favorite it girl from the 1920s was Josephine Baker. You know, shout out to Josephine Baker. She really inspired my look today. So like, she was a powerhouse during that generation. Like, she was like, she paved the way for a lot of black performers, and not just in America, okay, like also in Europe, because she she faced a lot of discrimination in America. And she found that when she went to France, and she found that in France she was accepted more, like even honored more. Like they would kind of put her in really nice opera houses and performing centers. Like they would really they really valued her talent. But in America she was seen as more like, you know, in America they couldn't really get past the race thing. Like they couldn't get past the color, and they kind of, you know, try to put her into a certain category, and like, oh, you know. So a lot of black performers or people that weren't really accepted in the States would go to Europe and try their luck there. And a lot of them, a lot of like European people really like jazz music. Like they really wanted that. They were craving it. They were missing it, and wanted to have that and be a part of that. Be a part of that culture, because it was so popular. Like that was the hot thing. You know how what's the music we have now? We have like mumble rap and all this now, but back in those times, like jazz was it. Like jazz was everything, and you know, the speakeasies and those kinds of like, and the jazz clubs and the with the dancers, you know, the chorus girl dancers, that was like everything back in the day. Like, they had things like flappers and all that. Like, so women were really, they weren't apologizing for being a woman. They were like being a woman, and they were enjoying it and loving it for what it was, you know? So yeah, not every girl was into the whole flapper look. I mean, the showgirls and the like chorus line girls and all that had a certain image and look to present, and that was obviously more flamboyant than the average girl for the 1920s. They would kind of overdo the makeup a bit, but it still had a very strong impact on younger women and the younger generation and the youth, because it really, like, the youth girls started getting into makeup, they started getting into vanity more, and yeah, so that set the tone for like a lot of decades after, in terms of like it girl and Hollywood glamour and, you know, all this kind of stuff. Like, the 20s set the tone for that, okay? So yeah, women were also cutting their hair short. Like, that was, you know, they weren't doing that before. Like, that was a big change, and they would wear like loose dresses. They would wear like, in the past, like, outfits were very stiff, and like they had the what are those called again? Those like corsets. They had like corsets and all that. But in the 1920s, they had loose clothing. So and even loose lingerie, you know, like loose kind of pajamas and all this. And yeah, and flappers also carried themselves in a way that was very kind of like nonchalant and very easygoing and fun and flirty, you know, and that wasn't really in the previous decades, which were a bit stuffier, you know, a bit more formal. That wasn't really common. Like, a woman was supposed to be, you know, poised and all this. She wasn't supposed to be like flamboyant and, you know, she wasn't supposed to be like that. She was supposed to be a lady, you know, she was supposed to have some class. But people found that youthful flapper charm and flamboyant fun charm. They found that to be desirable, and men found that desirable, and people found that fun and wanted to watch that in the cinema. Like, they wanted to watch, you know, fun girls that were just expressing and living out their youth, you know?